Todd is the Assistant General Manager at the Granger-Hunter Improvement District, headquartered in West Valley City. In his spare time, he prefers to camp, kayak, and hike with his wife and 3 children. So without further ado, Todd, I'll just pass that on over to you.
So I do apologize. Last year I did somewhat of a similar presentation. This is kind of an update to that one. So the progress that we've made in the last little bit and what our plans for looking forward in the future. So I have to admit, like many of you, it's been kind of fun to play around with AI stuff. And so a lot of my images here are actually AI generated. So you'll hopefully be able to pick out the ones that are not real and the ones that are real. But it was kind of fun. For those of you that don't know or weren't here last year, Granger-Hunter Improvement District is this service area. So we're in service most of West Valley City and parts of some of our bordering agencies, including this building here. This is kind of our easternmost thing. So like for reference, you're right here somewhere. So we have about 130,000 people and get a lot of our water from Jordan Valley Water. 70 to 80% depending on the year, and that comes from outside sources. We also have a number of our own wells, so we pump groundwater from this area. And we do not have a secondary system, so anything that goes along with that, unmetered or metered secondary, we don't have that in this city like some of the other cities do. So kind of a quick overview, I think I showed this one last year too, of where those mountain sources are and why that matters to us. Because as you've read, obviously, over the last couple of years, we had a lot of water, or less water than normal in the Deer Creek and Jordanelle system. And for those of you, I apologize, I know there's people smarter than me in this room that understand the Central Utah project better than I do. But a lot of that water actually is imported from the Uintas that would normally go to the Colorado River Basin, but is actually diverted here through a couple different tunnels and reservoirs, and it winds its way over to us. Obviously, we wouldn't actually have enough water in this area to support our whole population without bringing all that water in up to this point anyway. So that's kind of a quick overview of where 75-ish% of our water comes from in this city. And Salt Lake City has their own thing with a lot of their own mountain streams, and Metro gets some of the water from that too. So actually a lot of the water from a lot of the different districts here actually comes from this same system. So I wanted to show a little bit of the background of why we're looking at this and why it's important to us, and actually I think some positive developments over the last couple of years. There's a lot of data on here, so let me explain it here just for a quick minute. The total bars, if you add them up, that's the number of acre feet that we pumped out into our system. So if you've heard of an acre foot, take an acre, put a foot of water on it, that's an acre foot. It's a water buffalo term, but it's one that we use. Usually 2 houses use about an acre foot of water a year, if that gives you any indication. And you can kind of see our trends. This top line is our population that's changed over the last 20-ish years. And the one that I think is actually really interesting is our dotted red line, and that's actually our total water use if you start averaging it out. Even as our population has grown about 30-ish thousand people, or just under that, our total water use has actually trended down. So even with additional housing, businesses, growth, our water use is not even flat, it's actually going down. And so I think when you think about all the conservation measures that are going into place nowadays, emphasis on water-wise landscaping, all the slow the flow programs, toilets, shower heads, all the messaging, especially the last couple of years, if you really look, especially last year where we had very heavy drought messaging, one of our lowest, in fact, I think our second lowest water year in 20 years of water that we sent out. So when we talk about all that messaging that goes out, all those media stories, everything that we send out to our customers saying, hey, try to conserve this year. I mean, that's a pretty good indication between COVID and that year where we've dropped a significant amount. And I think a lot of different agencies saw that very similar thing where, hey, if you put that message out there and combine it with all the other programs that we've been doing, for example, Granger-Hunter and a lot of other agencies do tiered rates, right? So you pay less for that indoor water use, and then as you start creeping up, especially if you get to that excessive outdoor water use, I think ours is 45,000 gallons per month, your rate triples or so as you get to that top amount. And so I think as you start to see that, and we see these programs that we've changed, we've only implemented higher tiered rates just in the last few years, you really do start to see that it does actually have a pretty big effect compared to a higher water use year. So one of the things as you go into this is, and what we saw specifically last year was this drought contingency planning. So it's part of a reclamation program if you want reclamation grants, but it's also just good practice to understand if you think about those mountain reservoirs, and if Jordan Valley, our wholesale supplier, was going to cut back on our sources, what do we do in that case? The good thing is, again, with that graph, you've seen messaging can actually work quite well. Even this year, without a lot of drought messaging, because we had a lot of snowfall, the reservoir started to fill back up, we're on trend to be pretty close to that. So I think as you look at our water use, even this year, without that, people seem to have internalized that type of water savings mentality where they're thinking about it, they're conscious of those types of things, which I think is a good sign for going forward, even without like that drought messaging stuff, even with reservoirs that look pretty full, people still seem to be continuing down that path. And so one of the things that we've looked at is our drought contingency plan. So this is part of the Bureau of Reclamation's program. You can get some funding for this to look at long-term drought mitigation strategies. And so one of the things we looked at is temperature variations, and how does the temperature variations or long-term climate change impact reservoir levels, snowfall, rainfall, how does that come down? There's been a whole bunch of different studies and a lot of different opinions about it. But basically what we're looking at is that there's probably just going to be less snowpack, which is kind of a problem for us. It doesn't fill up the reservoirs as much. So one of the things that goes along with that is what I actually think is really interesting on the water purveyor side is indoor versus outdoor water use. And so we talk a lot about what's a responsible water use, or recharging the Great Salt Lake, which is a big one this year and last year. And one of the things that I actually find really interesting is this type of curve that shows you our indoor versus outdoor. So the blue, which is our indoor water use, stays pretty much the same. For us, it's about 1,000 acre-feet a month, pretty much straight throughout the year. We don't actually measure those two things separately. We can only guess, but based on January, February, March, November, and December, usually are about 1,000 acre-feet. So you can assume that that indoor water use stays pretty much the same throughout the year. In our master plan, it was identified for us that 95% of that water is returned to the wastewater treatment plant, which then goes back into the Jordan River, which then goes back to the Great Salt Lake. So that's good, right? We want the water to go back in there. You do use a little bit to water plants or whatever else, but most of it's toilets, showers, dishwashers, all that stuff. But for us, the big issue is this consumptive use, which is the outdoor irrigation. So I think this is it's a 5-year average. Based on our 5-year average, over half of our water is applied outside. And so that kind of gives you, and that's West Valley, tends to be a little bit smaller lots, and we do not have unmetered irrigation water. So you can imagine even other different areas that it might be different than that. It might be higher, it might be lower, depending on the mix of single-family homes versus apartments and townhomes and that stuff. So those are the types of things we're looking at as we go through and look at drought contingency strategies. So in some of our, I don't have any slides on it, but some of our drought strategies, we have the tiered rates, we have emergency tiered rates. So if we got into a spot where there were actually cutbacks, so if the reservoirs were really low and we were sending out messaging and people got to this low level but still couldn't quite meet it, we can actually bump up our rates, the top tiers, a little bit. Some of them actually double and become quite expensive in that higher range to, again, incentivize, because we're looking at this saying this green area is really the issue, right? It's not so much the inside stuff. That helps, but you can only do so much with a shower head. It's that irrigating of turf that really seems to push us over the edge as far as that overall water use. So one of the things we've looked at as part of that drought contingency is our groundwater in this area here. And there's been a lot of studies on this over the years. A lot of places have had wells. We've pumped wells for many, many years in the Salt Lake Valley. And it's actually kind of interesting. 20-ish years ago, there's a Salt Lake Valley groundwater management plan that broke up the aquifer into 4 parts and started looking at what is a sustainable yield. So how much can you pull out of that every year? And Jeff Denblaker referred to that, I don't think he's in here right now, this morning in one of our opening sessions about one of the things of the Great Salt Lake Basin planning is to start looking at these safe yields, not just for Salt Lake, but anything that feeds into the Great Salt Lake, and maybe start looking at whether these numbers, so not just the safe yields, but how much we're actually pulling out of it every year, is actually the right number. And it's a little bit hard to tell because there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. For example, like for us, we're Granger-Hunter. We're kind of in the middle of the valley, so we actually have wells in a couple different spots. And we have some more that are actually over here. And so that kind of gives you an indication of use. There's lots of wells in the eastern region. That seems to be, and I'll show you why in a minute, and not so much over here. The Kennecott plume actually contaminated a lot of the groundwater in that area. So, next slide. Oh, it got hung up. So one of the things we've looked at when it loads, I have a lot of data on the next one, is, there it goes, so this is a map that the USGS put together, I think about 10 years ago, showing recent changes in groundwater level in the Salt Lake Valley aquifer. So you can see here, and I still haven't explained why, but a lot of wells on this side, and you can see that the groundwater levels have actually declined a bit on that side. In the green area, that's pretty flat, and in the blue area, it's actually gone up a little bit, which is surprising. And we looked at our own wells, and if it's trending down, that's good. If it's trending up, that's not good. So we have a couple wells that are going up, a couple wells that are going down. If you run the average, it's about level, depending on where each of our wells are. So that'll go into, as Jeff and the Great Salt Lake team is looking at updating this stuff, they may refer to these types of charts to see what our safe yield is of what we can actually pump out. So I have to admit here, this is where I put my disclaimer, I'm an engineer, not a hydrogeologist, so if there's any hydrogeologists in the room, I am not a pro at explaining these types of things. But if you remember back from your high school geology class, we have recharge areas, so the Oakers, the Wasatch, and then of course the Jordan River down in the middle. And groundwater can eventually end up recharging some of the streams downstream too. And that kind of gives you a cutaway. They put some percentages to where the water comes from and how it's used. And I don't want to get into that too much, but there's been a lot of research done on the groundwater, sustainability of it, how much is used. And so it's been kind of interesting going through that. Now I'll explain why the wells are on the east side, and now you can see it, is that TDS, or total dissolved solids, that's, if you've ever been to a city where the water tastes kind of minerally, that's probably part of it at least, is the total dissolved solids adds into it. The lowest TDS is up on the east side, so that's where a lot of agencies, a lot of cities want to put their wells, is that's the best water over there. There's the Kennecott impacts from the well, and of course the Great Salt Lake impacts. And so the lighter green is decent water, not great. And then of course as you get closer to the Great Salt Lake, it becomes less and less potable. And so one of the things that we track is we're running our wells in the summer specifically for that peaking. When we see that 4 times water use compared to winter is our wells, and then we start tracking our water quality complaints. And so because we have the wells in those lighter green areas, our wells are kind of around here, we sometimes get those issues, not just TDS, but I'll explain in a minute, but we get iron and manganese issues. So if you've ever seen water come out of your faucet, hopefully not, but it will every once in a while look like that. Usually that's like during a pipe break or there's a fire and they're cranking open the hydrants. But what happens is this manganese actually, it oxidizes, and I have to put a disclaimer here too, I'm not a chemist, so I don't know the exact process, but the manganese that's in the ground, you can't see it, but when it oxidizes, when it's either exposed to oxygen or chlorine, oxidizes and turns to manganese 4, which is what is on this piece of PVC pipe. When you put it in, it's clear blue, right? And so over the years, we cut this piece out just to see what it looked like. And you can see that it starts to stick to the side of the pipe. And when you get high velocities, so say if there's a fire and they have to open some fire hydrants, you get a break and water squirting out everywhere, it'll actually resuspend that. It'll kind of scour that stuff off, and that's when you start to get water that looks like that or even darker. And so that's one of the things that we've been looking at is our groundwater issues. So as we went through the last few years looking at options that we could do to increase our groundwater use, reduce our reliance on those mountain reservoirs, we came up with these things. We want to decrease complaints, increase aesthetics, because this isn't actually, you wouldn't think it, but that's not a primary drinking water standard. So for the engineers in the room or for everybody else, there's primary and there's secondary drinking water standards. Primary you have to meet, secondary it's suggested but not a requirement by the EPA. This is actually just a secondary contaminant. So they have some suggested ranges, but it's not a health thing. However, they're planning on changing that in the next however many years, 5 to 10. I'm not sure that they really know. But it'll probably be regulated at some point, because that definitely doesn't look good, and I don't want to drink it, and nobody else should have to drink it either. So we track our water quality complaints, and the heat map kind of shows one of the two big areas is right around where our wells pump into the system, right? So our wells are kind of in this middle area right here, and as the water migrates out, that's where we start to see a lot of it. So we can kind of trace it back to those wells and causing problems. Here's some experiments we've tried over the years of, you can actually run these foam swabs, they're called pigs, through. You take your fire hydrants apart and push them through, and you can see it's scouring that pipe that I showed in the previous photo. That's what it looks like when it comes out, and that's not great at all. That's drinking water pipelines. That's coming out of a fire hydrant. And you can kind of see the runs as they went through it, as you start in the back and it slowly cleans up, and then there's your clean water once you run a number of pigs through it. We've also done some flushing trucks. That's where you hook up to 2 different hydrants and just pump water in a circle really fast. And you can see the filters there. That's what the filters look like after you've run them in a circle. The problem is that PVC pipe that you saw in the previous photo, that stuff does not come off without scouring it out like that. But the problem is, even if as you're cleaning it, when you're running your wells, you're just putting that stuff back into the pipe. So these were the main things, and the manganese is the one that's really causing the issue. And so we had a consultant come back from us a number of years ago and look at a whole bunch of different things that we could do to make the water better. I'm going to burn through this stuff really quick. So if you have any questions, just interrupt me. I'm good. And basically, we have a breakpoint chlorination. That's where you chlorinate things and it breaks bonds. And then you oxidize and filter it out. And I'll explain that in a minute. But there's a whole bunch of different options. This is the side view of that process. So you dose chlorine at the well. It turns that manganese that you can't see when it first comes out of the ground into that black stuff or the brown stuff that you saw in the previous photos. And then it can filter it out in this system. So this is the side view of a tank, and I'll show you the tanks in a minute. And it has anthracite and something called green sand plus, which is a manganese sand. And that has a chemical absorption, and it bonds to it. And then it just basically you filter it for a couple days, and then you backwash it every 2 to 7 days, depending on how fast you're running it. And that stuff just goes down the sewer system, and then they clean it out at the sewer treatment plant. And so the first project, AI photos, it would be cool if it looked like that, but that's definitely not. So this is our first project. I think I referred to this, we were just getting it started last year. And we have 3 wells. So we're sitting right here somewhere. And there's 3 wells. There's one over on 33rd, one just across the street, and one up the street a little ways. And we decided that we already had a pipe connecting all these 3, so we put the treatment plant right here. And this is kind of the concept of what we were going to do, or what we're all actually complete now. So this is there's a booster pump station, a reservoir, and the new treatment plant, and the well right here. And so this is when we start doing the design. Sorry, I'm going to geek out for a couple minutes, so I apologize if you're here for something else, but I like the engineering part. Doing kind of some 3D models, making it, it's called BIM, Building Information Modeling or something like that. It helps you catch conflicts. So we do everything in 3D. There's those 2 filter vessels with the chlorination system off to the side there. That's the backwash piping and the feed and finished water piping coming in under the floor there. So this is about a year ago. Started breaking ground, working on the foundation. There's the filter vessels. I think they came from Minnesota. The walls going up and the roof going on. Part of that part is ammonia. I don't know has anybody ever had water where it tasted like the swimming pool? You ever had that come up? Sometimes that can be ammonia, and that also naturally occurs in groundwater. And the way that you can destroy that is you actually dose it with chlorine, which seems counterintuitive, but it breaks the bonds and turns it into chloramines, and you don't taste those anymore. And so, but you have to have a lot of contact time, which means the water just has to react in a pipe before it makes it to your tap. So under our parking lot, there's actually a lot of pipe that goes back and forth, and everybody when they're building it looks at us like we're complete idiots and says, what are you draw from there to there, it just goes in a straight line. It's like, well, we need contact time, so I always have to explain it to everybody. It's like, we know what we're doing, we're not just wasting money. It looks kind of idiotic though, I have to admit. And so this is the finished building as of a few weeks ago. One of our things that we've had a lot of feedback on from a lot of public relations or public involvement people is water districts are really not good at doing community outreach and stuff. We really emphasize our conservation programs, and Jordan Valley, Central Utah, Salt Lake City does a really good job emphasizing that kind of stuff, but we're kind of quiet about a lot of the things that we're doing. A lot of people talk about infrastructure, right? Our infrastructure is aging. We have stuff that's 70 years old, 80 years old that's in the ground that fails and blows up. And so one of the things we've tried to do is a little bit of outreach. So a couple weeks ago for our community, we had an open house and a ribbon cutting. We tried something kind of fun, a truck or treat. And so we put some of our working equipment out there, dump trucks, backhoes. We have some sewer equipment that TVs and cleans lines, and invited the community to come out and see the trucks, walk through our treatment plant, and get some tours and learn about how it works and get some candy and stuff. So I thought that was kind of fun. So this is the, sorry. Okay. And so this is the final building as of a couple weeks ago. And it's running. We got our operating permit, so we're actually using groundwater right now, running it through the filters. And actually, it's nice to have that done. So on to the next one. Because we have multiple wells, we've got about 6 wells in this area, and we treated 3 of them. We've got a future plan, and again, that would be kind of cool if that's what it looked like. But we have a plan to actually build the next one. So up Redwood Road a ways, closer to 201, there's another well, and we're going to put another one in up by it to put in the second of these 2 treatment plants to do pretty much the same thing. The thing that's interesting now, going and doing drought contingency planning and working with the Bureau of Reclamation to get all that approved by them, is that they actually have some money set aside for these types of things. So drought mitigation projects, I think there's a lot of agencies around us because we're in the Bureau of Reclamation states. And they know that it's coming, and they can see the Colorado River declines and all that stuff. So they're looking at strategies to increase drought resilience that would mean less imported water and more reliance on our own sources. And that's part of this here. So they do Water Smart grants. We got $5 million from Bureau of Reclamation for this next project. And because manganese is an emerging contaminant, we also got a couple $1 million from that program to build the next one, because these aren't cheap. The last one actually between if you add up all the design, construction, pipelines that go into it, it's about $13 million. It's not an incredibly cheap prospect, but with federal assistance through some of the Buy America, or I can't remember all the acronyms, but IIJA and the other one, you can actually get some federal money to do that. So I have a few minutes left. If anybody's interested, after the last session and after you had a chance to go look at some of the posters and the drawings, we're going to go out there, and if you want to go walk through and see some of our facilities out there, we're going to meet there about 3:45.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd.